Robert Daly is director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. He joins us to discuss the end of the big meeting in China and also the arrival of President Trump for a 12-day visit to Asia.
Right.
Let me ask you to set the scene for us. I did a little bit of that, but we just came off this National Party Congress,
Right.
and President Xi elevated to new heights, and President Trump complimenting him on his amazing achievement, sort of
amazing
an odd
elevation,
statement,
I think, was
amazing
exactly
elevation.
what he...
And so set the scene for us of China's sense of forward movement and the momentum after the Congress and then President Trump wading into the area.
I think that the big takeaways from the conference were, one, Xi Jinping's announcement of a new era. And that's going to be his signature phrase. There's more to it than that. It's a new era in the development of socialism with Chinese characteristics. But part of this new era is that China, as she said, it's getting closer to taking a central role on the world stage. And this new era is a sort of a declaration of the end of China's period of tutelage, of opening, of learning from the West in terms of management.
It's no longer how to be a world power, it's now being a world power.
It's there. This is an announcement that China's moment has arrived, that it is confident, which is what the Chinese media have been focused on. And she says it will remain open and continue to reform, but it's also not going to take any critiques that it doesn't want to take anymore. And it's now quite boldly saying we are offering a model for nations that want to develop independently. Independently of what? Independently of Western prescriptions, moralizing, and that world order. And so not only has China entered a new era in Xi's formulation, it is to be controlled and defined in all aspects by the Chinese Communist Party. And this is taking several steps back from his predecessor's view of the scope of Communist Party action. And by a Communist Party with Xi Jinping clearly top dog. And so that's what President Trump will be walking into, a very confident, declarative Beijing, led by a guy who's flying high right now.
You know, it's really interesting to hear you describe it that way. When you think of the last major competition among superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War era, the threat of military confrontation always loomed large. Right. This sounds more like Coke versus Pepsi, our brand versus your brand.
Well, this is actually an apt way of looking at it as Trump heads to Beijing, because both leaders, Xi Jinping and Trump, are going to be playing, as they always do, primarily to their domestic audiences. But a la Coke and Pepsi, I think that the really important audience is in neither China nor in the United States. The question is, how does the rest of the world perceive the contrast between these two leaders? They're going to be making a comparison between the leaders of the two superpowers, Xi Jinping, now per many cover stories, the most powerful man on earth, feeling very confident, next to President Trump, who, and the rest of the world watches this closely, is I think now at about 38%, a historical low in approval ratings, with the FBI, Robert Mueller's investigation.
I think fair to say embattled almost since day one.
And embattled. And here they're going to be standing next to each other, blue tie, red tie, red tie, red tie, we don't know. And so the question is now, what do Americans make of this? What does the rest of the world make of this? What do they make of the trend lines? Where do they think that world order, that the rules, that the trade relations, that investments, and that international organizations are heading? And so I think that that's what we need to be watching.
When you mention trade relations, does the early decision by Trump to disengage from TPP, does that factor in here as far as the U.S. standing in the region?
The U.S. standing in the region is hurt, of course, by 2008, by the financial crisis, by the withdrawal from TPP, by the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, and also by a very general sense of disarray in the American political system. In China's narrative, it was 2008 that proved that America did not have a better economic prescription than China. And now, especially after the 19th Party Congress, if you look at the Chinese media, they're being very clear that America also does not have a better political prescription than China. Hence, China's confidence and its willingness to tell other countries that if they so choose, and they're very careful for now to not sound like they're being prescriptive, if they choose, they can follow a Chinese model.
I remember back in the campaign season, you did a speaking tour in China where you were talking about the U.S. elections, and you came back and reported that there was a fascination with candidate Trump at the time.
Yes.
And what are the feelings toward President Trump now in China?
Well, we're going to have to see. The Chinese will be extremely polite. They are marvelous hosts, and I think they are quite convinced that they can get more of what they want by flattering Trump. But he is seen as symptomatic of a United States which is in decline and whose political system is paralyzed and this is a bit of a contradiction, both paralyzed and flailing. I don't think that paralytics can flail, but it's seen as having both of those issues as he heads to Beijing. And he's seen as not having made a decision yet about his economic policy towards China, and I think is seen as something of a paper tiger. His bark has been very, very much worse than his bite. Xi Jinping, furthermore, right now is feeling confident, likes the trend lines in the relationship, doesn't have a lot of asks of President Trump, and is therefore in a position to behave and be seen as magnanimous within China.
The big asterisk that hangs over all of this is North Korea. If the North Korea threat wasn't what it is today, this meeting might have a whole range of different considerations, but now North Korea looms large. Any expectations of any major statement, any joint statement, any breakthrough, anything of that nature?
Well, both leaders, I think we can say safely now, will declare success, and will talk about their mutual respect for each other, and will certainly express their very deep concern and their willingness to work together. But how much more China can do to put pressure on North Korea, we don't know.
Is it a can do or willing to do?
Well, we don't even know the answer to that. It remains a black box. There is some speculation that North Korea's relative inactivity over the past month might be in part due to Chinese action and Chinese diplomacy, or it could be a lull in the development of technologies and the preparation for the next launch. In that lull, whether or not China has convinced North Korea to take it easier, China has also improved its relationship with South Korea. Just this past week, they're trying to get beyond the Chinese overreaction to Seoul's deployment of the American THAAD system and to strengthen that relationship with Seoul. Some of the writing in Washington suggests that China thinks it can peel South Korea away from the United States. That, I think, is overblown. South Korea had made very clear that it had every reason to have a good relationship with China, and in fact was developing such a relationship before the latest rounds of nuclear tests. So China is trying to walk back its overreaction to THAAD, trying to get closer to South Korea. I think this is potentially a positive development, depending on where it goes. North Korea has been quiet, and so we'll see. But I would not expect a breakthrough either economically or strategically from this trip.
Are there other issues that might be important during this trip? President Trump not just going to China, Vietnam, some other Philippines, South China Sea comes to mind. Did you expect any
South China Sea will certainly come up, especially in Vietnam and in the Philippines. There is some thought that in Vietnam, President Trump might, no matter how polite a guest he is in Beijing, give a speech which casts China in a harsh light, and which, especially with regards to the South China Sea. We're going to have to wait and see on that, but I think that that is fairly widely expected. In both Vietnam and then in the Philippines, he will be continuing what's seen as the most successful part of President Obama's rebalance to Asia, which is showing up diplomatically for big meetings. He will also be unrolling his version of, and the administration would certainly deny that it's a warmed over rebalance, but American commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. It looks like this is going to be the phrase, we'll see if that phrase actually describes a policy from the Trump administration, but an attempt to broaden the theater from the Western Pacific, where the South China Sea Islands and the Senkaku Diaoyus are, to include the Indian Ocean, which is in part about bringing India in as a closer near ally for some purposes with the United States, with Japan, with Australia, to counter China. So listen carefully for how this free and open Indo-Pacific is described by the administration, which is already saying that this, of course, is not aimed at any way at China, which the Obama administration had always insisted unconvincingly to most people's minds about the rebalance to Asia.
Earlier, you mentioned that President Trump has not yet clearly articulated a vision for a U.S. relationship with China or even with the region. Is President Xi clear about his vision for a relationship with the United States?
President Xi, I think, is much clearer on his policies in the region, his global ambitions, and what he would like to see from the United States. He knows that he won't get it easily, because I think what he wants primarily from the United States is a market for Chinese goods, non-interference in Chinese affairs, and cessation of American critiques of China as it continues to develop what it calls its One Belt, One Road policies, trying to play a major role in integrating Eurasia through infrastructure, as it continues to assert what we would call hegemony, what it would call its territorial rights in the South China Sea. But Xi Jinping, I think, is in many ways feeling more confident of his leadership within China and of China's status internationally, despite the many weaknesses that China still demonstrates, and despite the fragility of the Chinese Communist Party. So Trump will be meeting a man on his own territory who is probably at least as confident as Trump is, and perhaps more so. And the world, again, will be watching these two men side by side. And in some regions of the world, people will be making decisions about which way to lean.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting to watch, and I'm glad we have you here to guide us through as we do observe what's going on. So, Robert, thanks for joining us as always.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.